Hi, and good morning. This is Stephanie Sena. Welcome to the show, Thinking Constellationally, where we connect the dots between systems of inequity and between ourselves and our neighbors. I'm so excited to have a special guest here with us in the studio today, Kelly Morton. Kelly, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Kelly is the lead organizer for an incredible organization called Reclaim Philadelphia. So we're going to be having a conversation today about Reclaim Philadelphia, its roots and goals, its work in the city for advocacy, and its future, where we go from here. So on the show, we've talked about the work a lot of people are doing in their communities to strengthen the safety net. I spent a lot of time on that myself with my organization, SREHUP, Student-Run Emergency Housing Unit of Philadelphia, where we build community and housing for people who are homeless and their pets. But I have always been of the belief that we really need strong advocacy on policy and on systemic levels to really increase equality and make sure that our neighbors are all taken care of and not suffering. So I think that if we don't have policy initiatives and strong advocacy for progressive reform, what we'll have is a never-ending supply of people who need assistance. And the greater good, in my mind at least, is to make sure that everybody has access to the systems that can encourage their prosperity and their ability to thrive and to be happy and healthy citizens of our country. So with that said, I'm so excited to be talking about policy change happening here in Philadelphia on the local level with Reclaim. So, Kelly, please tell us a little bit about Reclaim. If you could talk a little bit about maybe first yourself and how you got involved with it.
Mm-hmm. So I got involved, Reclaim Philadelphia started in May of 2016. It was started by staffers and volunteers from the Bernie campaign here in Philadelphia with a heavy concentration at the South Philadelphia office, which is where I volunteered. And I personally got involved at that office with that campaign because I had spent a lot of time protesting the Iraq War. I protested with Occupy. And it wasn't until the Bernie campaign that I started looking at something of, there's something I could fight for instead of always fighting against. And there were so many, a lot of the stuff I was fighting against in Occupy had to do with, corporations and, influence of money in politics and how that distorted the way that our democracy was operating. And there was a lot in Bernie's campaign and platform that spoke to that, the 1% versus the 99%, which also kind of came directly from Occupy. So it was a natural movement for me from Occupy into the Bernie campaign. And when the Bernie campaign ended with the election in the primary election in 2016, I kind of took a month off. And in that month, some of my fellow volunteers and some of the staffers from that campaign office decided to continue the momentum that had been created with the Bernie campaign in Philly and not let that interest in political organizing die just because an electoral campaign had ended. And with that, they started Reclaim Philadelphia. I think in the very beginning, it had like maybe 15 to 20 people who were attending meetings. And in my month of burnout after the Bernie campaign ended and the first meeting I attended in June of 2016 for Reclaim, one of the old field organizers from the South Philly Bernie office wrote to me on Facebook. He, John Gamino, shout out. And he was like, you might want to get involved with this group, Reclaim Philadelphia. You probably know a lot of them, and like it's all the work that you care about. So I went to the first meeting that I went to, which I think might have been the second meeting ever for Reclaim. And it was the first time I heard about the goals that the group had locally. And one of those goals was protesting the DNC host committee, which in Philadelphia at the time was so many lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, and people that I knew didn't have my interests or the interests of most Philadelphians at heart, including, something that really pissed me off politically in Philadelphia was the Corbett administration cutting schools $1 billion in the education funding, and knowing that some of the same people on the DNC host committee held fundraisers for Corbett. To me, that was not in line with the values that we should be representing in the Democratic Party. And so when that was brought up in the meeting as a direct action that we could participate in, I was like, all right, sign me up. I'll take the letter in. I need to be part of this.
Wow.
And I also signed up at that moment to be a dues-paying member of Reclaim.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say, that your involvement in Reclaim really was at the beginning of Reclaim itself, in essence, that you were there kind of from early days, and it came out of the momentum that built around the Bernie campaign. And then, when his campaign ended, it was what to do with that, energy and motivation to change these systems of inequity that we have right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Incredible.
I have something else to say with what you were speaking about, your interest in lifting up the safety net and making sure that the people around us aren't suffering. It's very similar to my self-interest in organizing, which is that I see the systems not working for most people across the country, definitely in Philadelphia, when we have a 23% poverty rate, when we have the homeless levels that we have. And I also see the political and systemic causes for that. And Reclaim Philadelphia is best defined as a power organization. And you spoke about advocacy. And the way that we look at it is that there are kind of service groups that kind of meet a direct need, maybe a soup kitchen or something like that. And it's critical. If people are hungry, give them food. And then there's advocacy groups who might fight for one single issue, like Planned Parenthood, appreciated very much so. And then a power organization kind of says, this system, the power is distributed in a way that is not meeting the needs of people and is disempowering most of us. And so we need to build power together and use that power that we build together to address issues. And it can be multiple issues. It can be to get a candidate elected, or it can be to fight to end the School Reform Commission here in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania. Whatever the issue is in the moment that the organization wants to address, we have collective power that we've built together with the idea of taking on those larger systems that we can't fight as a smaller group, or definitely not as an individual.
Okay, that makes perfect sense, and I'm really grateful that you clarified that for us. There's an amazing book that I recently read that has me stunned. It's called Winners Take All: The Elite Charade of Changing the World. It's by Anand Giridharadas. I'm butchering that. I apologize, but it's a brilliant book, and I already understood a little bit a lot. I teach this about this needed system change, but really, when you said that there's these organizations doing direct service, I think we've gotten good at direct service, but it's a Band-Aid, right? And so there are a lot of nonprofits that exist and they aren't thinking bigger picture because it's not in their interest, right? So if your whole job is to serve people in need, then you need a never-ending supply of people who are in need, as opposed to figuring out how can we readjust these systems of power and inequity so that there is no one in need like that, so that we all have access to the resources we deserve because we're human beings and part of a community. So I love this idea that, in terms of the difference between a power organization and an advocacy organization, is that advocacy organizations, as you mentioned, can be kind of one issue, where a power agency can attack many different issues, but all from the framework of upsetting the status quo, which is really power and resources concentrated in the hands of very few. So amazing. Yeah. Well, I think that what you're doing is incredible, and I'm just so excited to hear more. So okay, so that's the early days, and then how did it get from that to where it is now?
So after the DNC host committee, we did some direct action with that. We kind of did some organizing and just canvassing our neighborhoods. We had come out of the Bernie campaign, so many of us as volunteers or staffers, and we knew how to canvass. And so the way that we canvass, it's something called deep canvassing, which is, we ask questions. We say, this is an issue that affects me, which is why I'm knocking on your door, and I want to know what affects you so that we can actually build power together and address the things that affect me and the things that affect you. And we had I think we came across the idea that most people don't politicize their own suffering. They think of it as something that they have to deal with on their own. But through those conversations, we often are able to kind of get people to think about things like education and housing and healthcare in ways that are political. And in doing that, get more people involved in what we're doing. So we did a lot of that for a while, and then we had different issue campaigns that came up. Electoral campaigns really helped build the base up. We worked on Joe Hohenstein's campaign up in actually this area, a little bit further east. And after electoral campaigns, we moved into different issue-based campaigns. Education was one of them from the beginning. We were with the fight to end the School Reform Commission. Public banking was another one, fighting for public banking, and I personally was our representative in a group that pushed the city to divest from Wells Fargo Bank because they had been the city's bank. They held $3 billion that we had, and they were using it to invest in dirty energy, and then also horrific racist lending practices. And so there was no reason for Wells Fargo to be holding our money, and that was a successful campaign.
Wow. And when you say racist lending policies, you're referencing how really redlining is continued today. Absolutely. Because banks are not lending to people of color and people in poverty. And we see that there was an incredible podcast out by Reveal in 2018 about and it's a podcast that was dealing with this issue that is facing people throughout the entire country, but they were focusing heavily on Philadelphia and Wells Fargo Bank. So, and this is housing discrimination. And when housing is where most of our wealth is in the United States, this is creating a system. If banks are discriminating against Black people and people of color, what's happening is that we are continuing a system of income inequality and racial inequality. Yeah. So I didn't realize that you had done that work with Wells Fargo, but there's a lot. If listeners want to hear more, I highly recommend them checking out the Reveal podcast on housing inequality that specifically deals with that.
Yeah, and we did reference that podcast actually. Since we've been working on it and working on pushing for a public bank in Philadelphia as well. The same thing, kind of community money should go to the community, and it should stay in and invest in the growth of all of us. But when you point out this difference in the wealth, I think that before going into other campaigns that Reclaim has done, our political analysis is very much based in the reasons that power is distributed the way that it is, with so few holding it and so many disenfranchised, is because we look at our country as based in racial capitalism. And the idea is that from the beginning, the only people who were actually considered people in this country or citizens were wealthy white landowners who were men, right? So it leaves out so many people from this country accessing power, whether through wealth or through really any kind of means of expression, and having themselves heard on any level where they can make an impact. And so that is what we are seeing in so many different places of inequity, whether it is housing or education or the criminal justice system is just a horrific mess of racial capitalism.
So to that end, how does Reclaim adjust for that within its board or leadership positions? I mean, does it actively recruit people who have been disenfranchised in the community?
So our organizing method is that, and this goes for volunteers as well as staff organizers, is that everybody, we want everybody to be organizing in their self-interest. And self-interest we defined as, if you have something that you've been directly impacted in, it can be hugely empowering to organize to fight for power in that issue. And so we have, people who have been like formerly incarcerated working on our criminal justice reform, which we call Mass Liberation Task Force. We have, and I think most recently we had our Judicial Accountability Table is a coalitional group that we're part of that works with other organizations fighting for criminal justice reform that looked at the judges who were going to be put forth in the primary and said okay, which of these are actually going to say now that they recognize that the system is racist and they recognize that there are all these ways that people get locked up for crimes that white people don't get locked up for just because they come into a court system that's already stacked against them and they're not seen as a valuable human being or a citizen really. And so that's one example of organizing in self-interest. Another thing is, parents who want to fight for the schools. But myself, I don't have kids, but the schools is something that I consider part of the safety net. And so because for me, the idea of a safety net and government actually working for people instead of a small elite group of people, that's my self-interest. I see that as something that is massively distorting the power dynamics in this country.
100%. That's incredible. And the idea that you would advocate for specific judges, which I think is really important because I'm not sure that a lot of people even know who those judges are, right?
Yes.
And they can have incredible influence on our policies. And
they're elected almost for life, right? Because they get in and their term is 10 to 12 years or something like that. But then they just get retained. They just show up on the ballot as a retention vote. Most people vote yes, and they're in for life. So if we are more clear when we're electing them who we're electing, then we can make sure that we don't put somebody in there who's going to do harm.
I imagine that a huge part of this work of Reclaim Philadelphia is also about education.
Yes.
Right?
This is one of my favorite things that we have a political education committee that we started actually after, it was kind of the evolution of a task force that I was running as a volunteer, and half of it was asking our members to run for Democratic committee person in the city, and the other half was creating a platform of reclaimed values and what we wanted to see on the local, state, and federal level. And that was just, it was a year-long process that we had probably about 20, 25 members who were just really geeking out on but in a very heart-based way of the future that we really wanted to see. Because one of the things that we named as, there's a lot of, just neoliberal and capitalist and white supremacy and patriarchy in the Democratic Party.
That's right.
As any institution. But then there's also this, there's no vision for what we could be living in, what the world could look like, and that was drastically missing for all of us. So we wanted to create that for our own organization. And so we also kind of had a chart to go by of what are we actually fighting for? What would progress look like in all of these different planks of this platform? So we created that platform over a year. And when it was finished, we were okay, how do we get this out to our members and make sure that people know what we're fighting for and what we want to do? So we condensed it into a 2-page platform that we shared with everybody, and especially people who are running for committee person. This is kind of what our goals are. And then the larger platform, we decided that we're going to need more ways to get this out. So our political education committee.
It's okay.
Okay. Our political education committee went, we have blogs, we just did a neoliberalism training that was really great and we'll definitely replicate. And we have a podcast.
Amazing. This is so fascinating, and I'm excited to be learning so much from you about really how people throughout the city can be engaged in making a difference and creating better systems of equality for all of us. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with our guest, Kelly Morton. Thanks. Amazing.
Yeah.
Don't wait. Communicate. Make your emergency plan today.
Okay, and we're back with our guest Kelly Morton, who's here to talk to us about the organization Reclaim Philadelphia that started in 2016 as a kind of a growth from the Bernie campaign. And once the Bernie campaign was over and Hillary Clinton had won the primaries, there was all this kind of, I think, devastation from people who had been working really hard to see Bernie elected, but then also, what to do with all that energy. I saw a woman holding up a sign in the maybe the Women's March back in 2000, maybe 16 or 17, and it stuck with me. This woman's sign says, if Hillary had won, we would be at brunch right now. Mm-hmm. And I have to look at that and think, like, that's the problem, right?
Yes.
Is that you and I are probably two people who've been engaged in these issues for a really long time. I think that when Obama was in office, there was so much progress that was made, and I don't want to diminish that, but there was still so far to go. Mm-hmm. And I think even starting with really the Clinton administration, or maybe even the Reagan administration, we had a dismantling of networks that had kept people afloat for so long, and really so much empowerment of corporations and private interest. Mm-hmm. And I think the public sector started to be, and the safety net both, were eroded over time. And that really, I think, was happening across party lines. And it was happening in different administrations. And a lot of people weren't paying attention. Yeah. And so even if those people who had voted for Barack Obama, who supported him, the idea that they could just go to brunch instead of being tuned in and paying attention, I think is part of why we are here. Yeah. And so while I am somebody, and you will probably can relate as well, was so angry for so long that I felt like I was screaming into the abyss, that I was protesting also, and I was bringing up these issues of inequity in my classroom and reading a lot, but it seemed I felt alone, that there weren't many people who were interested. And today I don't feel that way. Today I feel there's been mass mobilization, and I think Reclaim Philly is part of that. You have such a skill at organizing, and not just organizing, but also teaching, which I think goes hand in hand, and creating a more informed electorate, which is what we need. I think when Eisenhower was leaving office, he gave a farewell address to the nation, and he said that the United States was facing an existential threat from the military-industrial complex. And he said that the only thing that can ensure that we remain a democratic country that is beholden to our values of justice is an informed citizenry. And I think for so long we didn't have an informed citizenry. For a variety of reasons, people were tuned out. And I feel that people are tuning back in, and that's hopeful. So if there's any light that can come from the political mess that we are in right now, and a lot of the devastation and chaos that is all around us, it is that there are so many people who are inspired to take action. And so I'm hopeful for the first time, really, that we might see some massive groundswell, some shift, as people start to recognize that the personal is political, and they start to take back power for themselves.
Yeah.
So I'm really encouraged to hear about the work that you are doing and that Reclaim Philly is doing. So talk to me a little bit about what the platform is, what your goals are, and what your recent successes have been.
Yeah. So, I mean, we worked on well, very recently, Kendra Brooks running
Yeah,
for city council at large. Is
congratulations
very
on her
exciting.
win
Oh
for
my
city
gosh,
council.
huge!
Yeah.
Like, so exciting. Kendra's somebody that has been organizing with us as a community organizer for so long, and I actually interviewed her for Reclaim's podcast, and she was talking about fighting against the charterization of her neighborhood school, and I was just so impressed and inspired by her, and have been. I mean, she's the example of somebody who is, you know, in their own neighborhood, living their own life, and is just like, wait a minute, this isn't right.
Yeah.
Let me figure out what I can do, and then just does, like, leads, you know.
Yeah. She's a citizen of her neighborhood is Nicetown, I think, and I read that she is now renting in the home that her parents owned because it was foreclosed upon. And I think that they have been victim of, you know, of the housing crisis, the foreclosures, and how what we've seen over the last many years is resources, money, and power being consolidated in the hands of very few. And she experienced that firsthand with what happened with her house.
Yeah. And getting back to when you're talking about people who have been impacted being the ones to lead the charge, like, that is crucial. I mean, we definitely need that. And then that gets me to, like, you know, something that I think about from the political education standpoint of, like, technocracy versus populism, like this idea of, you know, we're always looking for an expert to tell us, like, what we should be doing. But, you know, the experts have been, like, selling us trickle-down economics for decades, and only recently we're like, wait, maybe that doesn't work. And so the same thing with, you know, when we talk about housing in this city, like, you know, there are going to be plenty of economists and developers who are like, no, the tax abatement's fine. But when you actually look at it, and when you live in this city, and when you see the gross inequity it creates, not just in housing but also in schools, like, you know that it's not okay, and it does need to end. And someone like Kendra being able to fight on that, like, from experience, is definitely the kind of leader that we want.
And I understand that, and I think that that's incredibly vital. I do have a question, though, because so with my organization, I'm working with people who are experiencing homelessness, and these are people who are in incredible suffering and poverty. How do people who are are suffering from these systems have the ability or the time to advocate for themselves? That I'm not sure how Kendra was able to do it, but I have a family, for example, right now who's living with me, a mother and her 2 daughters, who came to my house homeless, and they had nowhere to go. They'd been in the shelter system for over 2 years, and I couldn't put them back out on the streets, and they're living with me now. But the mother works 2 jobs. She's a one-on-one aide for children with autism in the Philadelphia School District, and her other job is a hospice care worker. So 2 jobs, and she still doesn't make enough money to pay for rent. So I think about someone like this woman who works so much to provide for her 2 daughters and can't make ends meet. And then I think, how do people like this have the ability and the resources to fight for themselves if they're having a hard time even paying rent?
Totally. And I think that goes back to the power organization structure, right? Like, it needs to be all of us fighting together for each other.
That's right.
And then we also, in those organizations, we need to make space for the voices of people who are experiencing it, so that they can help direct the even if they don't have the time or the capacity to be, like, leading the charge and spending 40 hours a week on something, making sure that what they are saying that they need is part of what we're actually fighting for. And that's something we don't see in government. That's something that we don't see sometimes in our organizing, and we need to be very, very careful not to let that happen, where it gets directed by somebody who is disconnected from the actual experience.
And so I wonder, do you provide any resources or help for people who are struggling in poverty to be able to make their voices heard? So, for example, I'm thinking of, like, childcare, which could be a barrier to having somebody who's on those front lines and who's struggling day in and day out be able to make the time and make their voices heard.
Totally. We work really hard. I'm, like, trying to create, like, a child care committee in Reclaim, but, like, it is our practice at our citywide meetings and at our task force meetings to have child care present.
Great.
And also in our leader meetings. I mean, we have single mothers who are part of our, you know, steering committee, like, definitely, and they need to be able to be present in those places and know that they're not divided in where their attentions need to be, and that they're taken care. And then also we have, like, these beautiful moments, like the neoliberalism training that we did. We had probably, like, 10 kids in the child care childcare room, and it was like this little group of like,
baby anti-neoliberals.
Exactly. Yes. And I was like, yes.
Amazing. My best friend in the whole world, Heather Boyd, she is actually works for Mary Gay Scanlon's office, and she's a political organizer herself, and has been really important in this shift we've just seen in Delaware County with having it turning blue for the first time. And she's was on the school board of Upper Darby, and really very outspoken and a huge community organizer. And then there's me, who does all of these things, lives this on a daily basis. And we have we have between us, we have 4 children, but our sons are best friends, and they had no choice because they were raised only a few months apart, and Heather and I were inseparable. And my son just had his birthday party, not birthday party. We went to dinner for his birthday, and he just invited Cole, his best friend, and Cole and Jonah, my son, are sitting next to me. Heather wasn't there. She couldn't be there. So it was just my family and Cole and Jonah. And I'm listening to them talk about like politics and have you heard about what's going on with the impeachment? And they're 13.
Right.
And I was like, that's great.
I love it.
It's great that these adults who are becoming, for the first time in their lives, politically active, are raising children with this mindset to be engaged, to think about this, to talk about this.
Yeah.
That's inspiring.
Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, so I love the idea that children are included in, and that you make space for them, not just because it's important if single mothers who are bearing the burdens of so much of this inequity can make the time and the space to have their voices heard, that they can know, rest assured that their children are cared for, but that also the children can be part of this process. Yeah.
We definitely see that also more in the neighborhood organizing. Like we have neighborhood groups like that like are where like our base kind of comes home to each other. I mean, at a citywide meeting, there's like 300 people, and it can be hard to be like, oh, like I know this person, they live down the street from me. But if you're just meeting for a potluck or a meeting with people who live like within 8 to 10 blocks from you, you can really start to develop like relationships and be like, right, there are people who live around me who share my values and want what I want and are fighting for this, and it can help us not feel alone in this work. Like you were saying, like sometimes you had felt alone, and that's something that like really creates that community that we want to bring largely, right, to the way that we're looking at politics, to the way that we're looking at how government works. And recently in I think South Philly, like just south of my neighborhood, at like it's Ward 1. I know not everybody knows those district lines, but like Passyunk Square area. That neighborhood group had a potluck, and they had I think 17 adults and 10 kids at this potluck, and it's just like so great to think about like that community being built in a way that there wasn't a child care room, like the kids were just all up in that potluck, and like that is like a really beautiful thing. But I do want to also talk about like when you're saying about like this sign, and I was also similarly affected by that sign about if Hillary had won, we'd all be at brunch. I think all of this kind of plays into the neoliberal attitude toward politics and the shift that did happen from my perspective, and this is the training that I was telling you about, where if we look back to the New Deal, and FDR is like, creating all of these systems to build out this safety net, but he's doing it in a time period when women didn't have rights, when people of color didn't have rights, when like immigration was like, pretty much solely for work, and it wasn't anything beyond that. And definitely LGBTQ rights were just like not even on the table, right? So there was this entire swath of people who were really left out of the gains of the New Deal, and then social movements came in and tried to like move that needle over to include more people in the safety net, and then you had the neoliberalism backlash being like no, and it shifted the idea that had started to be created in the New Deal and the social movements that government and society should work to support people and keep people out of suffering, keep people out of poverty. And it shifted it to we have to protect markets because markets will take care of us. And we bought into it from Reagan on. And I say we largely. I think that there are so many ways that the narratives of neoliberal ideology have like been embedded in our heads, whether through education or through, the way that we as a society operate. And one of those is that we have to do everything by ourselves. And for people who, have the privilege of being, white, for example, or have already been wealthy or have inherited like a certain level of economic stability, it's very easy to be like, oh, I'll just pull myself up by my bootstraps and everything will be fine, and lose sight of the fact that all around us there are people who that methodology and that way of thinking is hugely cruel and absolutely not functional, and it leaves people behind, and that's where we're at now. And so the idea of going to brunch when that's the case, no matter what, because that's the case, is a blind spot that we've all kind of been part of in different ways. And the more people that we can get to kind of see that methodology and that buying into those neoliberal ideologies, they not only hurt other people, but they also hurt us, because they put us in that place of like, everything's fine, it's fine that I'm paying thousands of dollars for health insurance, or I could be like one medical emergency away from being evicted, or whatever the case may be. Like the systems are not working for almost all of us.
Yeah, and we need each other. So there's two books that I'm reading. I'm in a romantic relationship with my books. We're getting married, and I'm reading a ton of books right now. But the two that have me reflecting a lot on what you just said. One is called Braiding Sweetgrass, and the other one I think is The Secret Lives of Trees. I might be butchering that name, The Secret Lives of Trees. I'm going to look it up right now. But they both books highlight really how in nature cooperation is prized, even with trees, that there are these, if we really study the history of forests and trees, what we know is that trees that are communicate with each other and share resources with each other are stronger. And if you have a tree a forest where a tree is felled, or if there's trees missing, there's these missing links, and everyone becomes weaker. And that when there's a forest where the trees are all sharing kind of sugars with each other and resources through their roots, it makes for the whole community of trees to be stronger. Yeah. And I really relate that to humans also. And I think that at one time in human history, that's how we operated. In fact, I would say that is the majority of human history, really. Actually, there's another great book, I geek out on books, by Chris Harman called People's History of the World. Chris Harman was a student of Howard Zinn, who wrote People's History of the United States. But Chris Harman says that for 95% of human history, cooperation was prized, and that people really shared resources with each other. People operated in a gift economy, and I've been reading a lot more about gift economies. That's also in the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is just gorgeous about indigenous teachings and what we can learn from plants and from indigenous populations. But this, in the gift economy, people supported each other, and land was held in common, right? And this idea that everything is private property, and that we are each an individual, I think makes the entire community much weaker. Yeah. But we've seen these policies over time, I think from the Reagan administration onward, really fraying the safety net. And what we have today is that Census Bureau recently reported statistics that our income inequality is greatest it's ever been since that was a measure that was being counted by the census, which is over 50 years. Our income inequality is at its highest level ever since this was a measure that they started counting over 50 years ago. And someone recently said to me, they said Trump's going to be reelected because the economy is doing great. Yeah. This argument that the economy is doing great makes me kind of sick, especially because at my house I have people who are experiencing homelessness who I host for dinner maybe twice a week, and then I have this one family living with me, and I think I can't imagine them coming for dinner and me saying, I can see you're suffering, but good thing the economy is doing really well. Yeah. Right. So when someone says the economy is doing great, my question is for who? Exactly. And who is it not working for? And the reality is it's working for fewer and fewer of us. Yeah. And, we can even look at other numbers like unemployment is down. Well, unemployment is down. The woman who lives with me works 2 jobs. Yeah. Right. And we can count that. Jobs, exactly. Right? Where they're not livable wages. Yeah. So I feel like those jobs shouldn't count. people can't live off of them, which is what we're seeing more and more. So I think that it's important to really anchor this discussion in context and history of how we got here, and then also a vision for how we can undo it.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to follow that up when we come back from our break, but we'll be right back with Kelly Morton. Thanks.
Sometimes the things we do or say can make others feel hurt, excluded, or isolated. Everything you say and do creates an impact.
How am I supposed to save the whole world?
You can't think about saving the world. You have to think about saving one person.
Because of you, someone's entire life can change. You don't have to be a superhero to have a positive impact.
Friends?
Friends.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies. Selfies. Nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Craig, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Okay, great. And we're back with Kelly Morton, who is the lead organizer for Reclaim Philadelphia. And we're having a conversation about the history and the impact of Reclaim. And I think that it's doing such an incredible job of galvanizing people throughout the city to be engaged in the political process and to really see the personal as political and then act from that place, which I think is incredible. So I asked you a question about what were some of the successes, and we kind of talked a lot about Kendra Brooks, who's fabulous, a huge success. She just won a position on city council for working families, and in doing so, decamped a Republican member of city council. And she's someone who has incredible ideas and a long history of working to uplift her family and her community. Tell me a little bit about other successes and your platform, and hopefully we can also have a little conversation about where we go from here, what you see as the future of Reclaim.
So electorally, we did a lot of work to get Elizabeth Fiedler elected in South Philadelphia, and our current political director was her campaign manager. And she's doing excellent work that we're really excited about, especially going forward with the fight for school funding for toxic schools. And then Larry Krasner, of course. We knocked on a ridiculous amount of doors. I always forget what the total number is, but it was in coalition, of course, with so many other groups who cared about criminal justice reform in the city. Those were two huge wins, and the Krasner victory really kind of shifted the criminal justice system, not just here and the narrative about criminal justice, but also nationally. Like when we go to national conferences and stuff, people know who he is and kind of can talk about that. And then the canvassing that we did from that was really, really exciting as well. Like hearing people change their minds at the door. With education, we were part of the push for the Ending the School Reform Commission, and we are in coalition with the Our City, Our Schools Coalition, which is now pushing for the ending of the tax abatement, and they lobby City Council every week regarding that. And we currently have a new housing task force that helped push forward the lead bill that was recently in City Council, and is currently still in the fight, although it looks like it will be successful, the right to counsel.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
So important.
Totally.
I'm actually going to talk about that in a few weeks. I have guests who work for VIP who are lawyers who help who help people who have evictions on their records, or help them get those evictions taken off, or help advocate for them as they're going through the process. But yeah, this bill I think is hugely important because I see it as a major contributor to homelessness today, especially family homelessness.
Yeah. And then the ongoing push for the housing task force is going to be affordable housing. I mean, the way that that's talked about in the city, I feel like we're in a city where developers are so prevalent financially and verbally in city council that, we have somehow accepted to a degree this idea that like building luxury condos is addressing affordable housing, and I don't understand how that is ever accepted. And
I just want to, I don't mean to interrupt, but this is an issue that's incredibly close to my heart.
Yeah.
And what we have, just for some statistics and numbers, you mentioned earlier 23%, so almost a quarter of all Philadelphia is living below the poverty line. And that's approximately 400,000 people in the city of Philadelphia. And of those people, about 80% of them are in the private market for housing. So these are people who are also not getting, they're not subsidized, they're not getting any kind of vouchers or assistance from the government, and their average pay, they pay on average about $750 a month in rent, and this is not sustainable, especially because Pennsylvania has the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, which is also the federal minimum wage. States can raise the wage higher than the federal wage; they can't just go lower. So Pennsylvania basically says we would pay you less if we could, we just can't.
Yep.
So that wage has not been raised since 2009, and in that time, the cost of living has gone up 13%. And also between the time of 2015 and 2017, housing prices went up over 40%. So we see what's happening is this massive increase in the cost of housing and the cost of living, but wages remaining stagnant. So a lot of people who've lived here and worked here forever are not able to get housing, to stay in housing. And then when it becomes nearly impossible to get a voucher because there's decades-long wait list, and evictions are so easy when they're automated, especially if this is a corporation like Lublin Corporation that owns a lot of housing stock and predominantly serves people who are low income, and then can evict them if they fall behind on their rent. So I think that housing affordability in the city of Philadelphia is a major issue, and I'm excited to hear that Reclaim is working to address this.
There's sometimes this idea of, I think you know this, that when developers like ask for a variance or they want to build higher than they're allowed to, instead of actually paying into affordable housing, which is one way that they can or actually building affordable housing, they can just pay into a kind of slush fund, and this really incentivizes the developers to just build whatever they want and not focus on affordable housing, and it keeps neighborhoods getting gentrified. It keeps all this, housing in neighborhoods at this level of luxury condo, and this affordable housing is, either not being built or it's being built in places that aren't accessible to jobs or people's neighborhoods where they grew up. And
then there's no public transportation either, so they're really locked.
Yes, and the schools are, falling apart wherever they are. So when you get into this idea of how affordable, all of this, it's so intersectional, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, the housing and the transportation and the jobs and that are low paying, and the schools that aren't invested in. This is all what I consider safety net, what I consider public wealth.
Yeah.
And this shift.
It can seem overwhelming when we look at it and see all of these issues.
Yeah.
I tell my students the flip side of this being so all pervasive, and this issue really of inequity and power being distributed in the hands of very few, and that the majority are left powerless. I think that the flip side of that being so overwhelming is that there are so many points of entry. And so if you build a system like this where you empower more of our neighbors to come together and fight for their own interests and their needs, what happens is that everybody has a place in this fight, right? Depending on their own interests and their talents and their skills skills and their time, right? But it's all inclusive because in order to affect this change, we do need all hands on deck. And that's something that Reclaim Philly and you as lead organizer are skilled at doing, is getting more and more people invested in this, because it is going to take every one of us.
Yeah.
It's a huge lift, but it's not impossible. And we know that because I know this for two reasons. One is that there are better systems of equality in other places throughout the world, right? And there's places in the world where there is no homelessness, where neighbors care for each other. And they're also, for 95% of human history, we have lived in accordance with shared resources, and not this, what we have today with all the resources being distributed in the hands of very few. And I think that if we understand that 95% of human history, to think that this system that has only been operating for 5% of all human history is going to last us forever, despite the fact that more and more people are being disenfranchised and are suffering and dying because of this system, in addition to the fact that our planet is on fire, in crisis. Everywhere we look, we see this is not working. And in order to change something that is so huge and pervasive, it's going to take all of us. So I'm so energized to know that there is an organization like Reclaim Philly who is seeking to engage all of us. So where do we go from here? What are your kind of goals and hopes for you've already had so many incredible successes and done so much work. So how do we get more people involved, and what's our next steps?
So we have 3 main issue campaign groups that are working on specific issues. There's education, housing, and mass liberation. And so joining any of those groups, like based on what you're most interested in, is definitely, I think, the way that most people come into us and get involved in our organization. I would offer the neighborhood groups as another way. I mean, like, it's kind of one of those things where if you know very clearly, oh, I care about housing, that's my thing, and I want to fight on this, it can be easy to get in through a task force. If you are more like all of it is my problem, coming to a citywide meeting like the one we'll have at the end of January, or getting involved with your neighborhood group and meeting the people around you who care about it too, and then like kind of developing a path for yourself with the neighborhood leader is like a really good entry point. The political education team like always needs people doing research, writing blogs, helping with the podcast, all of that kind of stuff, because to me, like, it's really important, and something that helps build our movement and invite people into it is the more that we realize that there's a reason why we bought into this, and there are ways that people talk about things that we need to reject, and we need to pay attention when we hear neoliberal talking points, and be willing to confront the fact that capitalism doesn't work, and that capitalism is based on patriarchy and white supremacy, and they all work together, and if we're saying yes to one, we're saying yes to the rest of them, and that's not that doesn't make us communist, it doesn't make us terrifying, it makes us people who actually want this world where we're all taking care of each other, and where we're not colluding in the suffering of people around us, including ourselves, because like this isn't working for any of us. So political education is another thing that I would invite people into. We also have caucuses in Reclaim, which are like more social places for people. There's a people of color caucus, a queer caucus, there's a gender justice caucus, and these caucuses are places where not only can there be kind of socializing, but there's also a kind of like, let's bring this lens to the organization, and at the next leader meeting we're going to say, hey, we need you to use pronouns in every meeting or every time a leader introduces themselves, or hey, we need to talk about like the ways that we're organizing that is accessible and inclusive and reaches out places where we might not naturally go, to make sure that we're reaching the most people in a neighborhood or in the city. And so the caucuses are another place to get involved.
That's amazing. And so if people want to learn more about Reclaim, there's a website they can go to. You mentioned you have a podcast.
Yes.
What's the podcast called?
Our Political Moment.
Okay, and this is on iTunes and Stitcher. And if they go to the website, they can find places where they can subscribe, join the mailing list, and get involved and kind of don't just get involved, but bring a neighbor, bring a friend.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I actually started learning a little bit about Reclaim when I saw that a lot of my neighbors were running for ward positions. And I was like, what is this thing that everybody's getting so involved in? So there's a lot of opportunity to get involved, even on the small level. And I do think that, we have to be thinking on the small level. In terms of start political activism on the place where you stand, and work to change local politics first, and from there spread out. And you did mention that you have that you work also in tandem with other organizations in other cities throughout the country.
Yeah. So we are part of we're an affiliate of a national group called People's Action, and they definitely share so much of our political analysis, and they have provided a training method that we've adopted, and there are organizations across the country who are also affiliates of this. So we have trainings, and we have movement politics, retreats and meetings together, and they're so inspiring. I get to hear from people in Detroit and Michigan what they're working on, and so often there's overlap and parallels, and people fighting for affordable housing, people fighting against criminal justice, just dominating and decimating neighborhoods, and always schools. I mean, it's but all aspects of the way that neoliberalism and capitalism are kind of disinvesting our world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that it is so important to be invested in and engaged in the local level, but to be sharing best practices with other cities, because, as you're referencing, we're all sharing a lot of the same problems. And so when we expand our net and try to catch solutions that are being offered in other cities, we can expand our, possibilities and think kind of about new systems to include here to make for a more democratic and more engaged citizenry. So I love that you have you're part of a bigger affiliate and have this opportunity to connect with people who are working on these same issues in different cities. Kelly, we're out of time, but this has been incredibly informative, and I love to be in this chair as student and to have you as our teacher. So thank you so much, Kelly Morton. And if anyone wants to learn more, they can go to Reclaim Philly's website and get involved. Thanks for being with us, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Sometimes
What do you think you're
the
doing,
things we
Kevin?
do or say